Yo, what is up guys, it's Chillfeed and I'm here to give you my updated version of my Phasezerking goddess Amara build, which is by far my most popular video. And this build just got a lot better with the recent update that increased the level cap by 3 levels and introduced probably the best weapon to use on this build with the Broken Hearts Day event. So before we get into this build, why not leave a like on this video to help me out, or maybe if you already watched part 1 and enjoyed this build. But with that being said, let's not waste any more time and let me show you where to put those 3 extra skill points and how to switch Mayhem 4 to basically easy mode. And of course, when I was talking about the weapon that got introduced to the game with the current event, you already knew I was talking about the wedding invitation. And of course, this is a weapon that can be used on basically any character and one-shot most enemies in the game, but that doesn't mean the build is just good because of the weapon, nor does it mean that it can't be great with other weapons. I was using this build with weapons like the Nemesis, the Companion, or sometimes even the recently added Polyamorous, and I was doing really good for the most part. Anyway, the wedding invitation is probably the best weapon to use on Amara for mobbing and for some bosses as well, due to her potential to face grasp every enemy in sight at once. And with the amazing one-shot potential this weapon has by itself, you can one-shot sometimes 8 to 9 people at once, and not just regular bandits or Maliwan soldiers. I'm talking badasses, anointed enemies, every single enemy, in solo or even in co-op. And since this has been my favorite build in the entire game ever since I discovered it in my first playthrough, I figured it might also help some of you guys who are going to play Amara for the first time with a detailed guide on how to distribute your skill points, because this is a great build to start a new game with as well. And I guess a lot of you guys are playing the story again with the added cutscene skip. Before we get started though, here's the overview of the build for anyone who doesn't want to listen to my boring German accent and just want to pause the video and copy the build. And now for those that do want a detailed explanation on the build, let me start with the first skill you want to put 5 points into that can be found in the Fist of the Element skill tree, which is Anima, and of course before that the action skill Face Grasp from the same skill tree. And Anima is pretty self-explanatory since it simply increases your status effect damage by 20% and its duration by 100%, and you're going to want to focus on elemental weapons with this build anyway. And the wedding invitation is also always incendiary, so perfect match basically. The skill also gives you an action skill status effect damage bonus by 40%, but that doesn't really do too much for face grasping other than some larger enemies, and even then the damage isn't that much to be worth talking about. The next 5 points should definitely go into Tempest, which to me is a no-brainer, because having plus 30% elemental damage and even plus 50% shock damage to any elemental or shock weapon you will use is just way too good to pass up on for this build. And now let's assume you are leveling up Amara. You now want to go for the first possible augment in Allure to pull your enemies towards the initial face grasp victim, which the upcoming augment will greatly benefit from. But before we get to the next augment, you need to put just 1 point into Dread, which is definitely one of my favorite skills for Amara. With just 1 point you get plus 15% gun damage for 8 seconds every time you face grasp an enemy, and every time any player in your party kills a face grasp target, their weapon will be instantly reloaded. And like I said, this build works just as good in co-op as it does in single player. Now the next skill is probably the one that is the most optional for this build, and I pretty much only took Steady Hands because I'm not a huge fan of infusion, and I also wanted the best possible accuracy for a sniper rifle like the wedding invitation, especially on longer distances or even when firing from the hip to get those sweet critical hit one shots. And even though it isn't necessarily hard to hit criticals on your enemy in this game, it is pretty much required for almost any sniper rifle to do good enough damage, so why not make sure your shots will always land where you're aiming at with this skill. And then after you've put 3 points into Steady Hands, you can go ahead and put 1 point into Wildfire before you can equip one of the essential augments of this build, which is going to be Ties That Bind, to link every enemy that is close to your initial face grasp victim. And if you then deal damage to any of those linked targets, 35% of the damage they receive will then be shared between all the other linked targets. And even though this works decent enough with the combination of Allure, it will get even better with another augment later on. And now, before we are going to head over the Mystical Assault skill tree, we will leave one more point in Deep Well, simply because it's only one skill point for an increased magazine size by 20% for every elemental weapon you use. This isn't really necessary when using the wedding invitation because it returns one ammo into your magazine on every crit, but if you should get bored of one-shotting everything, or if Gearbox decides to nerf the weapon for some reason, this is great for basically any other elemental weapon in the game. And now, like I said, let's shift our focus on the Mystical Assault skill tree for now and maximize the skill Do Harm. This is one of 3 skills that will benefit from the rush stack mechanic, and definitely the best out of the 3 for this build. The reason for that is that usually for every kill you will get a stack of rush to a maximum of 10, and then when you activate your action skill, you will consume all of the rush stacks to increase your action skill damage by 45%, provided you gain 10 stacks and maxed out the skill. Of course, face grasping usually only deals damage to larger enemies that cannot be grasped, so in this case this wouldn't make too much sense. But luckily for us, the augment Ties That Bind counts as action skill damage, which means every enemy affected by Ties That Bind will automatically receive the damage bonus from Do Harm, and as good as this already sounds, this will also get better later on. And again, before we can get there, we'll need to spend some more skill points. 3 of those skill points will now go straight into Transcend to increase our accuracy by 38% and critical hit damage by 27% after activating our action skill. And you can imagine how good this will work combined with the wedding invitation. The next few skill points are somewhat optional in the way you want to distribute them, but I suggest you go with 2 points into Alacrity or Violent Tapestry at first to finally unlock the augment I was talking about, called Stillness of Mind, and this is where the real fun begins. If you exchange a lore with this augment, every enemy affected by Ties That Bind will now also be face locked, and as you can see in the video, it just works amazingly good. And just like that, the base of this build is complete. Everything from here on out will just focus on maximizing your damage for your action skill, having your action skill active almost all the time, and then mix in some more survivability and you're good. And speaking of survivability, we will now go back to the Fist of the Elements tree after we put just 1 point into Ascendant to increase the duration. Your enemies will sit in their Stillness of Mind bubble to 0.75 seconds after taking damage. This again is not needed for the wedding invitation, but every other elemental weapon, so why not leave 1 point in here. Now, like I said, back to the other skill tree and focus on some much needed survivability. Before we can get there though, again, we need to put 3 points into one of Amara's best skills called Indiscriminate for the chance to ricochet bullets to other enemies and an even higher chance to ricochet bullets after they have been hit by your action skill. So basically the Jacob's weapon trait as a skill, and you can never go wrong with that. One more last thing to do now is put 1 more point into Wildfire to increase the chance for a status effect to spread to 16%, because we need to advance in the skill tree and we don't need melee damage for this build. 1 point into Anima won't be doing us any favors, and nobody ever uses Catharsis because it sucks. And now there you go, 2 points into Sustainment, and that's all you need for survivability basically. And since you'll need to constantly hit your enemies with elemental weapons in order to make Sustainment work, your points into Alacrity for faster reload speed are even more important, and it also benefits from points spent into Violent Tapestry, Tempest, Wildfire and Anima, since status effects caused by your weapons count towards lifesteal, and obviously the more damage you deal, the more health you get in return, so every skill point into damage skills are well spent, and they are the reason 2 points are enough for sustainment. Especially when you are using the wedding invitation, you will need to just hit 1 shot and your health goes back up to 100% because you will deal more than enough damage. I will say though that for the takedown, and especially the true takedown mode, which you can see in the video, you can struggle with just 2 points sometimes and might need to go 5 out of 5 in sustainment, but that's not that much of an issue, since the next skill you're investing 3 points in is completely optional and basically just a nice little damage bonus. This will be our only skill from the Brawl skill tree and is called Personal Space, which increases the damage you deal up to 36% depending on how close you are to the target. Now you might think this won't work well together with the sniper rifle, but the damage bonus is still pretty nice on longer distances, as you can see on our handsome Jack dummy here. I was hitting him for 35k damage on what I would say is the common engagement rate in this game without personal space active, and after I put 3 points into it, I hit Jackie for 42k damage, which is a nice little bonus. On top of that, the little fire explosion going off on your enemy when landing a crit with the Wedding Invitation will also receive a boost, so it's even better. And with that, we are officially done with the Fist of the Elements and Brawl skill tree. Let's get back to Violent Tapestry and Alacrity in the Mystical Assault tree again, and let me tell you why you can choose between either one of those skills, and also let me explain why I went with 4 points into Alacrity and 2 points into Violent Tapestry. As you can see, the effects of both of these skills are also dependent on how many rush stacks you gained before activating your action skill. And since by the end of the build you will be activating your action skill pretty much constantly, and therefore you will always receive a bonus by plus 2.3% reload speed for every stack, and I don't have to tell you how nice it is not having to reload, especially for those of you who are playing MOS. And even though when you are using a Wedding Invitation later on, with its ability to return 1 bullet into your magazine, that makes it possible never having to reload anyway, it's still great if your guard aim gets distracted by maybe someone telling you to clean your room or the fire alarm going off or something. It's great to have that increased reload speed to get back into action right away, and by action I mean of course one-shotting your way through the game. Anyway, I just thought plus 2.3% was enough for your reload speed, and even though you don't really need an increased status effect chance from Violent Tapestry, again when using the Wedding Invitation, it's still nice to have on any other elemental weapon in the game, and works great with almost the entire Fist of the Elements skill tree and the skills you have invested in. Moving on from there, the first of the last 5 skills you want to put points into will be Wrath, to increase Amara's gun damage by 20% and by 40% after she activates her action skill. Again, a no-brainer to me, and awesome damage for just 3 skill points. Also just 3 skill points will be needed for Laid Bare to further increase our damage by 25% from all sources to targets that are hit by your action skill, and remember, the Augment's Ties That Bind and Stillness of Mind counts as action skill damage, and therefore every enemy affected by them will receive 25% more damage. Then you will just need 1 point into Remnant, and that single point will be enough to deal sometimes over 5 million damage to another enemy via a homing orb that will seek them out after you killed an enemy with your gun. The damage provided from the skill isn't necessary at all, but what makes this skill so great is the added overkill damage to every seeking orb created, and this in combination with the one-shot ability of a, again, Wedding Invitation, take a shot every time I said that in this video, and the Guardian rank perk Overkill is pretty awesome to say the least. And moving on from there to the last skill with 3 points, which will be Awakening before we can get to our capstone. Just because why not increase your rush stack effectiveness by 30%, since we've put points into all 3 skills that are affected by rush stacks anyways. And then finally the capstone that makes this build all the more awesome, Avatar, and its ability to not bend air but instead to allow for 10 bonus rush stacks, and also, most importantly, it allows Amara to activate her action skill while it's cooling down before having to wait for a cooldown. With that, you have the ability to constantly lock your enemies in place, constantly have an accuracy and critical hit damage bonus from Transcend, constantly trigger ricochet bullets, constantly trigger Laid Bare, Wrath and Dread for an insane damage boost, and trust me, chances are very high that before you will have to wait for a low cooldown on your action skill, almost every enemy in the area will be dead anyway. And then for a perfect transition to the gear you want to be using with this build, you can make Avatar even better by simply equipping any Phasezerker class mod, which you can get from the end boss in the Trial of Fervor. This class mod is probably still my favorite class mod for Amara, just for this build alone, because it gives you +5 maximum rush stacks and then allows you to get maximum rush stacks every time you will use your action skill, which again will be constantly. On top of that, it will give you a weapon damage bonus and action skill cooldown rate for every rush stack collected, and since you can use your Phase Grasp infinitely if you don't hit any targets with it, this means you can go into every encounter with 99 rush stacks every single time. Simply pair that up with the wedding invitation from after collecting 100 hearts in this current event, or any other elemental weapon that isn't called the LOB or ASMD, and you're set. Now, if you can get an anointed It's Piss Grenade that weakens your enemies, the wedding invitation will also be great against most bosses that have an easy to hit crit spot. I would then suggest going for a stopgap shield that drops from El Dragon Jr. for damage immunity after your shield breaks, because this can happen especially in something like the Slaughter Shaft, but after the 5 seconds are over, all the enemies will be dead anyway. And for some more amp damage in any other activity, you can't go wrong by equipping either an OM shield, which can be harder to get since it drops from Roten the Invincible in the Takedown, or just go with a Rerouter shield because it's easier to get, because it drops from Princess Tarantella II, and because why not? If you want some extra survivability, I'd go with an Auto Idol artifact from Tyrene the Destroyer, and that's it. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like the video if you are still here and enjoyed this build guide or found it helpful, and with that being said, I see you in my next one.